I'm Don Leopold. I'm the chair of the Department of Environmental and Forest Biology, and I am lucky to host this event. I want to especially welcome Dale Travis and his wife, Sigrid Frundorfer, who are in the front here. We just had a wonderful dinner together. Dale graduated from Wood Products Engineering here in 1959. He felt there was too much scholarship being done here that people didn't know about, and I think you're going to hear a lot about some of that in just a few minutes. So he generously funded a public lecture series at ESF. It started in March of 2013 with the speaker who's here tonight. And after this, he's going to take a little rest. He's had enough of a workout for 2 of these lectures. But at the time we were trying to figure out what to do for the first lecture, he just couldn't make up his mind between snow leopards and the Galapagos turtle. That's something we all struggle with, those choices. And so finally he settled on the snow leopard, and it's actually lucky because so much work has happened on his project in the Galapagos with the tortoise since. So we're going to get a really nice update. But back to Dale. You can read more about Dale in the program. Should be on everybody's seat. On behalf of ESF, I want to thank Dale Travis for supporting this lecture series and for being such a loyal and generous alumnus and friend of ESF. So Dale, if you wouldn't mind standing up just so we can recognize you. And Dale's done a lot for the college besides the lecture series, really instrumental in the chestnut work by Drs. Powell and Maynard. So it's really been a great friend and asset to the college. To Dr. Gibbs, Dr. James Gibbs, world-class scientist. We hear that a lot. It's not usually true. It is true in James's case. He's an exceptional teacher. We hear that a lot, and it's actually true. He's gotten lots of teaching recognition. And it's unusual for someone with such scholarship to also be so popular in the classroom. He's also a highly valued colleague. I probably owe my life to him on at least 2 or 3 occasions. Once on the side of the Long Island Expressway. I remember that one. Once in Mexico, a few other places, but what a great traveling companion. Knows lots of languages, very smart, and we had a wonderful weekend driving a blue Volkswagen through Long Island a few years ago I'll never forget. So I won't talk much more about that story, but he launched this series in March of 2013 with his lecture on the conservation of snow leopards in the Altai region of Siberia. He's been to the Altai region 8 times. He's been to the Galapagos about 50, starting when I think he was about 15 or 16 years old. So tonight we get to hear about his work in the Galapagos, which has gone on for decades. Since 2013, there have been many interesting developments, which he'll highlight tonight. Please read about James's many accomplishments in the program. He's currently professor of conservation biology, and he's the director of the Roosevelt Wildlife Station. And connected to that station is the very nice exhibit outside. Oh, by the way, there's no food. You don't see the reception area, so we didn't eliminate the reception. It's just outside. So please stay with us at the end, and the food is out there. We wanted to open up the hall for more people, so we had less people sitting on the floor violating fire codes, which happened last time James talked. So besides the many accomplishments listed in the program, James is simply an extraordinary scholar and teacher, and we say that too often, but it's absolutely true, and it's a privilege to have him as a close colleague. After his presentation, assuming there are questions, we'll have time for a few questions if there's time after 8:30 or so. So James, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many folks here. And thank you, Don, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Dale and Sigrid, for making all this possible. And thank you all for coming. I am delighted to be here to tell you about a place that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. When I was 4 or 5 years old, growing up in Quebec in the mid-1960s, my father just vanished. When you're 4 and 5, you don't quite understand what's going on. And then he reappeared about 3 months later. And now I know he was part of an expedition to deliver the first medical care to the Easter Islanders. But on the way back from Easter Island, they stopped at this place called the Galapagos, or he always called it the Galapagos. And he told stories about this land of volcanoes and fumaroles and gigantic tree arboreal cacti, and of course these incredible giant tortoises that are almost too hard to believe. It sort of got into my psyche as a little boy about this magical place that might actually be real, and to do, to some extent, everything I could to get there someday. I had a very good fortune. I have, as done not quite 50 times, but 45 times to travel back and forth to the Galapagos. First as a volunteer, age 19, for 6 months. This is what your hair looks like when you haven't had a shower for 6 months. And especially then as a graduate student, my graduate advisor, Jeff Powell at Yale University, came into the lab one day and said, "So James, what do you know about giant tortoises?" I said, "A little bit." And then he said, "So I think we should write a proposal." And I said, I do too. I don't think much is known about these animals. And off we went. And I'd like to basically capture for you, now that I've some of the things that we've learned and done in the 22 years that we've been working on these animals. It's been quite an interesting set of evolving insights that have informed management, and I think led to a pretty hopeful story for restoration for this magnificent group of creatures. So first, I need to just introduce to you these magnificent animals. This could be a lecture unto itself, but just a little bit of natural history here to start. And the first point I want to make is giant tortoises are truly rare, unusual forms of life. They now occur just on 2 places on the planet. The Galapagos here, in 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. But they also still occur in the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, unrelated, at least in terms of any recent sense. But I want to make the point of that these are not at all anomalous sorts of creatures. These are the very first ones to go extinct when humans colonized continents. They're large, they're helpless, and they're delicious. They were on every continent except Antarctica until just 10,000 years ago. They were even on Australia and New Zealand in these bizarre forms with horns and clubbed tails. But in Galapagos, they actually, the likely ancestors to these animals were actually dramatically larger, so maybe they actually miniaturized when they got to the Galapagos. Galapagos is unusual in that it's the only place on the planet that's hung on to multiple forms of these creatures. And I put that, this is a large complex of species. We're still trying to figure this out. You would think we would know this time in the history of science how many giant tortoise species there are, but I'll get into this in just a moment. But we think there's about 15 different forms, basically each major island in each major volcano. For a bit of scale, this is 90 miles by 40 miles, and this is like driving from Albany to Boston, if you will, in terms of distances. But each major island and each major volcano has its own species. They've been there for about 2.5 to 3 million years, diversifying, and they're a major part of this archipelago. There's 2 major types. Much of the Galapagos is extremely arid. The aridity is just, some years there's no rainfall whatsoever. These animals make do on their metabolizing water from their fat and with their water bladders, and go for 1.5 years without a drink of water. But usually there's seasonal rains, but much of the guts of the Galapagos is very low and very arid, and we get this distinctive form of tortoise with the saddle backing, which is unique among all turtles on the planet. And this is really its function. Much of the year, when there's a little bit of rain, there's stuff to eat on the ground, but the rest of the year, it's reaching up for anything you can find. And the saddle backing enables them to reach up to incredible heights. I'm not exaggerating the ability, by raising up their legs and their necks, to expand their domain, their foraging radius, and to acquire what little there is to eat. These animals aren't particularly mobile, especially on these arid islands. There's not a lot of, it's either green or it's mostly brown, and they're quite sedentary. But on the larger islands and the larger volcanoes, there are perennially moist zones. There are even sphagnum bogs in the Galapagos, something you'd think more from the Adirondack Mountains. But these are the really big ones. And because there's a perennial source of food for them to access, they have this more domed morphology, the dome shell type. And these are They're just massive herbivores. You know, it was really a bit of a sweepstakes that, you know, a mammal didn't get to Galapagos and become the big herbivore, or in the case in Hawaii, geese really were the big herbivores. In Galapagos, it happened to be a reptile and a tortoise that arrived, and they basically filled this niche. And herbivores they are. I recently did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and it was about 1,500 pounds of vegetation every year that they're consuming per tortoise. They're not particularly efficient digesters. They takes about 20 days for a mouthful of grass to pass through them, and when it reemerges, it doesn't look a whole lot different. They are not, but they consume a huge amount of forage, but they're also, when they can, they get more delectable, more nutritious items such as fruits, and they're consuming these in large numbers as well. And between the physical impact of thousands of tortoises consuming the forage and then consuming vast amounts of seeds preferentially, these are, you wouldn't necessarily guess this, but they are extremely migratory for two reasons. One is the food's good up in the middle elevations and the high elevations, but the only place to nest is down low where it's dry. So females undertake big nesting migrations. But they're also on these moisture islands just moving around to take advantage of where green appears, and they're migrating up and down the flanks of these volcanoes. This is a large animal, and you can see, for example, the guava seeds smeared all over its mouth. But they are great. It's good to think about these animals in a slightly different way than just really cool reptiles. They play a major ecological role in dispersing plants and disturbing their environment in which they live. And this is a tortoise dropping, but again, when you have thousands of animals milling around and distributing these moist packets rich full of seeds, you've got a major, basically, natural gardener in these ecosystems. It's through this disturbance then that we're sort of re-envisioning them and as more of ecosystem engineers. These are kind of the environments they create. This is a tortoise trail from the lowlands to the highlands. It looks a lot like an ATV track, but the wheel diameter is not quite right, wheelbase. But these are the areas where, for example, they are going in to pick up droplets of moisture from the ferns and the mosses in the early morning mists, and their nighttime beds that they press their bodies into to conserve heat and harvest heat from the soil long into the night as it gets very, very cool. But they're major disturbance agents. We've just started to do some research building. We built 30 of these exclosures, chain-linked exclosures. And you can just sort of look in here and look out of here and just see what vacuum cleaners they are essentially for things such as these very nutritious cactus pads. The vegetation is changing profoundly after just a couple of years. I just want to add one last point about these animals being so mobile. They're doing all of this herbivory. They're doing all of this dispersal, but they're doing it at an incredible scale. Now, this is the Alcedo volcano. It's a caldera that's 5 miles across, and we've got 110 giant tortoises with 10-year tags that report 5 times a day their locations. And on this volcano, there's actually about 7,000 tortoises. This is just a tiny number of them. And these are just the tracks of a very small sample of these tortoises across a 5-kilometer-wide caldera over the course of just about 6 months. This came as a big surprise to us. The tortoise and the hare fable is not entirely off. These animals cover an incredible amount of ground and carrying seeds and creating these trails, and they really do. If you extrapolate this to the 7,000 tortoises all doing the same thing up here, you get a sense of just how they're shaping this landscape in a profound way. Why care about giant tortoises? Why conserve them? It's a good question. In this particular case, it's fairly easy. They obviously are very fascinating forms of life. They're exemplars of adaptation to extreme environments. They actually, as we pointed out earlier, they're not all that unusual. They just were recently extinct around the globe. They're just hanging on in this one archipelago in large numbers. But they are truly unusual and life forms. This ecosystem role, though, that they're playing, this is what an island looks like that lost its tortoises a long time ago, and we're trying to restore them back to it. It's now very difficult. These ecosystems fundamentally shift into new states that are hard on a lot of species. These tortoises are having a hard time getting a toehold back into this ecosystem because of the woody plants have moved in and basically taken things over. And so this is the rarest albatross on the planet that nests on one island. They seem to have a dependency on tortoises to create open areas for them to land and take off. They're huge. That's a 6-7 foot wingspan. But really, tortoise restoration is more than just about recovering these numbers of these fascinating animals, but it's about restoring these ecosystems and all the other species that depend on them. And last but not least, you can make a very strong argument for economic argument. These are the Galapagos is an old Spanish word actually for tortoise. There are about 300,000 people who go to the Galapagos every year, each paying $3,000 to $4,000 each, which is, wow, a real commitment. And the number one reason they go to the Galapagos is to see a giant tortoise. They go for lots of other reasons, but this is a huge economic engine for an entire country, and it's not to be trifled with in terms of it generates a huge amount of revenue that goes back to the continent, and it's very important for the overall economy of the Republic of Ecuador. So ecosystem engineers, economic drivers of tourism, and fascinating creatures are all behind an interest in saving them and restoring them. So here's the conservation challenge, is that Galapagos is unusual. It's got multiple species still. It has, as far as we can tell, maybe 20,000 giant tortoises remaining, but that's just 10% of the original numbers. They're severely depleted in numbers and in distribution. The real insults to this spectacular set of creatures came actually long ago, especially in the early 1800s. It's connecting whaling and actually the history of this part of the world, Long Island, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, this is where all the sperm whale industry was operating out of. And back then, sperm whaling was going to the Pacific. It was a 3 to 4 year voyage. Sailors would arrive, no Panama Canal, go under South America. They would arrive starving. And giant tortoises, this was the first stop for virtually every sperm whaling vessel. We think they took 150,000 animals out of here. They would actually take them live, the ones they could carry, and store them on below decks where they could live for 6 months to a year and provide fresh food to the sailors who were otherwise starving. But the hundreds of thousands of animals that they took, it was both whalers, it was sealers, it was pirates. Buccaneers used this as a hiding place for many, many decades. That was the real blow. Then colonization occurred in the late 1800s, and that was the further blow to these animals. They were essentially, it's really interesting, you read the news articles from the 1940s, 1930s, everyone's bemoaning the unfortunate but inevitable extinction and loss of these fascinating creatures. It threw up their hands. There was really nothing that could be done. Well, fortunately, in 1959, the Galapagos National Park was established, and they started with 2 people and a little cottage, and the very first thing they focused on was giant tortoises. They have done wonderful, wonderful work since really getting a focus on giant tortoises in 1965, about when I was a tiny little boy, and to recent times, basically arresting some of the most serious declines, saving some of the most imperiled forms. Starting basically, this is Craig McFarland who did the first surveys. They didn't even know which islands had tortoises and where they were. This is Fausto learning about nesting biology and how to hatch giant tortoises. But for a long period, really, until fairly recently, the tortoise conservation was focused on saving very, very endangered species from outright extinction and dealing with this nemesis scourge, which are the invasive species that people brought into the islands, especially goats. Goats have a powerful effect on ecosystems. They're extremely efficient foragers. They have teeth as opposed to sort of inefficient beaks like tortoises. They have their hooves, cause incredible erosion. They reached unbelievable numbers in the Galapagos. And the Park Service has achieved international recognition for their ability to basically control these animals. This is what you get with a goat infestation. This is the island of Santiago, inside and outside. And very recently, Galapagos was effectively declared goat-free. And this, in a sense, was really what was a huge threat that's now under control. They've had to deal with the ongoing problems with black rats, dogs, pigs, you name it. But the goat problem has been largely arrested. In 2012, we gathered a group of folks together and just sort of asked, okay, the most egregious problems have been addressed. Basically, there's a point of stability in the Galapagos with these animals at 5%, 10% of their original numbers. Sort of to move the patient off the operating table, maybe out into the recovery room. What looking far ahead, what would actually restoration mean, and what would that involve? And so that was the origin. There's a great group of folks we convened in Galapagos: zoo biologists, lots of park guards, invasive species extermination experts, turtle experts, geneticists, planners. And many others. And we hatched this thing called the GTRI, or the Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative, in which we're right in the middle of, although it's really going to be a centuries-long program. And it's basically looking forward to actually restoration here is the key. How do we actually get from 10% back to 50%, 80%, 90% of original abundance and distribution? That's really what I'd like to talk to you about today. My near and dear colleagues, Linda Coyote she's really works at the Galapagos Conservancy, and she is sort of our overseer, our logistician, our planner, our strategist. Wacho Tapia is the guy on the ground who makes everything happen. I'm the scientist, but we also all kind of share these roles and very much enjoy working together. And we've assembled some other key people to make all this work. It's been Gisela Coccone at Yale University as a geneticist, and Joe Flanagan is the head vet at the Houston Zoo. And together, this is sort of the core team with the Park Service doing all of the final decision-making and all the implementation, if you will. And what I really want to do is walk you through some of the elements of this Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative over the last few years, partly because it's case by case, it's quite interesting, but this has all come together in a way that we had never anticipated. And also, I hope that you see that it's an unfolding and that it will continue to unfold in interesting ways. Fundamentally, we're providing expertise and advice for the government of Ecuador in the form of the Galapagos National Park Service to consider. But we have a wonderful relationship. They're looking for guidance, and they have, and we spend a lot of time sitting and talking, helping develop priorities for the annual plan, but really figuring out what needs to be done to move tortoises basically from just saving them to restoring their numbers. So a lot of this is providing advice. A lot of this is based in the field. Galapagos is still a very remote place. Some of it remains essentially unexplored. We have an expedition leaving in a couple of days to a part of an island that's never essentially been explored, and we know there's hundreds of tortoises out there, but we don't know exactly how many or where. But the tortoises, having been reduced to 10% of the original numbers, are not exactly the most accessible places anymore. So there's a lot of this is field work. And this is a wonderful video that our News and Pubs put together of just preparing for one of these expeditions, but getting equipment down to Galapagos for the park, especially boots, and alcohol bottles and sleeping bags and sleeping pads, and this is just a key part of all of these operations. Very difficult to get useful material in Galapagos, so we spend a lot of time acquiring needed items and getting it down there to Galapagos to make these expeditions happen. So I'd just like to walk you through, I originally had this, how does one recover a tortoise, complex, one island at a time, but now it's really, I would have said that 2 or 3 years ago, but now I have to say all islands at once. I think you'll understand the implications in a bit. But this has progressed in a very hopeful way, but not in ways we actually anticipated. Let me just start with a very simple example of ways science can inform management. And this is on the main island of Santa Cruz, really the only major settlement, although San Cristobal also has a port here. About 15,000 people live here, and they live with 6,000 giant tortoises on this flanking area here. A well-known species, Calanoides porteri. This is the port, and this is the agricultural zone, and these tortoises stream up in huge numbers up and down this slope on their annual migrations. Well, some goat hunters said, you scientists, why don't you, there's some tortoises on the other side of the volcano, why don't you go look at them? And we're kind of, it's one island, you can't really have two different species of tortoises on the same island. But they insisted that they looked a little different, and we made a couple of expeditions into that far side, and we found a very few of them, very strange size distribution, almost just a few adults and a few little ones and nothing in between, just really devastated by poachers and by burros of all things, eating out the cactus out from under them. And got some blood samples and sequenced and resequenced, and we now have come to realize that these folks were correct. In fact, the biggest distinctions among any tortoise species in the whole archipelago are between these two groups of tortoises on either side of this volcano. Clearly, we're dealing with two separate colonizations of this island. This doesn't look like much in terms of distance, but it's a major thermal wall. As I mentioned, sphagnum bogs up here. It's not easy for tortoises to cross back here. There's other geological barriers to them. But they've been on these islands together for this same island for a very, very long period. And we sort of just discovered this right in the nick of time because they were just about gone. And it's sort of triggered a whole new conservation program for Calanoides donfaustoi. I was thrilled to see the species featured on ESF's top 10 new species. It does have an odd name, donfaustoi. We debated at great length, but it's actually a contraction of an honorific for the head keeper of the Galapagos tortoise keeper, Don Fausto Llerena Sanchez, and Don Fausto is his honorific, but to honor all of the work that he has done for these many, many years. But just in time, basically, to rescue this form. It's now getting a lot of attention, and that it really needs. So Don Fausto is behind the success of another program on this island here, Española, down to the southeast. The first island whalers would encounter coming up from Cape Horn. They denuded it of tortoises very, very early, even wrote in the logs, don't bother visiting, there's nothing left there. It's an incredible story unto itself. It had been given up as extinct when the park was established, but the first director said, I think we should make a trip, and that was a sailing trip back then in the early 60s, and they went down and they found a tortoise, and they sensed there might be others. They ended up collecting 14 that hadn't obviously seen one another for decades. They were covered with lichens, meaning that they weren't, there was no mating going on. They recovered a 15th from San Diego, who is this big tortoise here, coming back to how he was taken out in the 1930s, and here he is popping out of his box. He must have been having a deja vu experience. But he completed this group of 15 that are all, this is the 60s and the early 1970s. They're all still alive and well and breeding. Tortoises give us chances and opportunities to recover species that we just don't have with others. But Don Fausto here figured out, when no one else could figure out how to breed these animals in large numbers, in the Centro de Crianza, which is the tortoise rearing center. And it's not trivial. This was at a time we now know that tortoises have temperature dependent sex determination. That is, the temperature which the eggs determines their sex. They had to figure all this out. They had to figure out diets, nutrition, all kinds of things, but they did. And I love this picture of this box. This box has produced something like 6,000 little tortoises, not only from those Española animals. It's just two cabinets, one within another. These are cut-off bottles of water jugs filled with vermiculite and tortoise eggs that they harvest from the animals they have in captivity, in which they produce small tortoises for release back to the wild. And this is getting back to the Española story. This is one of the first tortoises released to Española in 1973. This is us in 1994. And to make a long story short, and this is where we come in, making sense of thousands and thousands of records of marked tortoises, first marked with machete cuts, then with brands on their shell, and now with fancy pit tags like you use in your dog and cat. A lot of statistics behind this, all the mark recapture analyses we teach here. We've learned some very important things. This is the total number of tortoises released to this island from those 15 founders. This is the number surviving. It's about a 50% survival rate, which is incredible. When we release animals endangered ones back to the environment, 10% survival is usually pretty good, but 50%. The most intriguing thing is this little gray bar, which is the proportion or the number that are native hatched. So these animals mature sexually at about age 20 to 30. And what you're seeing here, basically, these are the native hatched, the nativos. They're appearing about 20 to 30, 25 years later. And what this is basically telling you is that those first tiny 5-year-old tortoises have reached a size where they're reproducing. Now, this is going nuts. This is really taking off. A lot of models, a lot of statistics tell us this population now can take care of itself. There really are, their numbers are secure. There's really no scenario at present that would cause them to go extinct. And so that's good to know. That's caused the park to think now, should we continue this program? It's very expensive. These 15 animals in captivity, all those offspring, continuing to generate them. Should it be terminated, or maybe we could think of some other use? So to relate to another island then, to link this together, the island of Santa Fe is a very sad situation. It's near Espanola Island here. But it lost its tortoises early. It's a very small island. It's a very accessible island. No one was really abandoned very early, even by the whalers. And there's skeletal remains on the island of tortoises, but there's no hope ever of finding. They're probably gone by the early 1800s. There's no zoo on the planet that probably still has a Santa Cruz tortoise. Santa Cruz is a very interesting island. We estimated that there's 220,000 of these giant cactus trees. It's almost like out of a Dr. Seuss book. It goes on and on like this, the whole island. But it doesn't have its tortoises, its original tortoises. You can, again, find remains of them. This is just one piece of a carapace of a giant tortoise, but no hope for any kind of living descendants or survivors of this lineage. Well, the geneticists told us, Gisela, and part of this larger scientific enterprise to both understand the evolution of the animals, but how they're related, that in fact those skeletal remains, we can extract DNA from them. They're very, very closely related to the Espanola group, as well as the San Cristobal group. There's sort of a group of tortoises here that they form a cluster. And we thought, well, given that there's no Santa Fe tortoises left, but this island still needs tortoises, where can we get them from? And just at the point where they're thinking about shutting down the Espanola operation, we say, why don't you just turn the spigot to Santa Fe Island? And so this is getting into the realm that makes some people uncomfortable, but these aren't the original tortoises for Santa Fe Island. They're from Espanola. They are technically an analog species, and some people find that concept unnatural. But this is where conservation is at these days. This island still needs this ecosystem engineer. This is the closest living lineage. And so we proposed, and the park agreed to actually move ahead with, again, turning the spigot of animals from Espanola to Santa Fe. And in May 2015, and I've just got two minutes of just spliced out some bits of a video we had produced on this. This was last year, released 205 of these little Espanola tortoises. This is at dawn in the Centro de Crianza, to taking them to Santa Fe. I want to show you this video just to give you a sense of, all the pictures and graphs are in the world are great, but just to get you a sense of what it's like to work with the Park Service and to work with these animals. So these are 5-year-old Espanola tortoises, and all this is going on the early dawn because the heat does stress them. And fortunately, Santa Fe is quite near the main breeding center, but it's still a trek out to the island and then to cart them up the island to the release zone. But leaving at 4 in the morning, 3 hours over to Santa Fe, unloading these animals then onto a smaller boat that accompanied the larger one to get them onto the island. Those are sea lions you can see, wondering what the heck is going on. And then carting these up 5 kilometers into the middle to the release zone. Each of these guys has got about 70 to 80 pounds of tortoises on his back. and it's treacherous in some parts. It's quite easygoing in other parts, but the idea was to get them from the Centro de Crayons on another island to the release point by about 11 in the morning. And there's an endemic iguana on this island, that the pallid iguana, that the only other herbivore, and we're very interested in understanding what will happen there, but in terms of the interaction between the two species, but eventually to the release point. And this is Moises Villafuerte releasing. Some of these have radio transmitters, you can see, but letting them go. And we've established these different exclosures again to measure the impacts that tortoises will have over the long term. And we went back in June this year, and we were astounded to find every single one of estimate every single one of those tortoises had survived the year. They've never been in the wild before. They haven't ranged particularly far from this release point, but they're doing extremely well. We fully expected and planned to find dead animals, but nothing of the sort. So that has been one of the criticisms, is you can't just release animals from the captivity of the wild without some kind of soft release process. But tortoises, they seem to be just fine figuring it out on their own, and there's a lot to eat here. So just a little anecdote here that actually isn't so much of a little tiny anecdote is on this island, as we were planning this release, we just poked around to try and find the best release site. A place with a lot of cactus pads for these animals, are very nutritious, calcium-rich, protein-rich. And just poking around some of the far-reaching parts of Santa Fe Island, we came across this. And I have a size 13 foot, and that's a footprint of a tortoise. Unless it's an elephant, it's a big, round, plantigrade footprint. And it took us a remarkable amount of time to find this animal. You would think this is a huge tortoise. This is just to give you, it's one of the biggest ones we've ever seen. Male. You can see, including the indentation of the plaster on the lower shell. But clearly this animal, we don't know where it came from. It doesn't belong here. It's in no way an arid zone tortoise. Morphology is all wrong. You never get tortoises this big on arid islands. Someone moved it there, probably 10, 20, 30, 40, probably more than 40, 50 years ago. It has done very, very well for itself. We want to get this animal out of there because having a large, mature male tortoise with all of these little ones coming on is problematic, but it's a big animal. We have to figure out how to get it off. But we've also genotyped it and found it comes from the adjacent island of Santa Cruz. So someone, for some reason, moved it. So I'll end the anecdote there, but I just want the human-mediated translocation of tortoises turns out to be very important as we go a little bit farther in the story. In fact, you would think it's an annoyance, but it's actually potentially saved a species or two. And so on that note, let's look at this island of Pinta. It's far in the north here. It's the northerly of the islands in the Galapagos archipelago that is occupied by tortoises. And it's actually a kind of a sad situation on Pinta. I don't know, have folks probably maybe heard about Lonesome George, this famous tortoise that he was found in 1971, actually by entomologists who said didn't make any. Tortoises have been thought to be extinct on Pinta Island since really the 1910s, 1920s, when the California Academy of Sciences made a final expedition to collect the last ones. And they took all they could, and they hadn't been seen since. But an entomologist was wandering around and saw a tortoise, didn't think anything of it, made a note in their book, but a year later at a cocktail party, commented to someone, "Yeah, we saw a tortoise on Pinta," and people went nuts. "What? Yeah, you've got to be kidding me." And they went out and they found that tortoise with every expectation of finding more. And this was the famous tortoise, Lonesome George. And as you're probably aware, no mate for Lonesome George has ever been found. For 40 years, he lived in captivity, reminding the world about what it means to be almost extinct, really a poster child for conservation. They tried all manner of things to gather gametes from George, to interested in mating with other tortoises, that maybe to produce hybrids. he was clearly, there's probably a reason he was the last tortoise, last member of his species. He was probably a pretty reclusive animal that just avoided things, and including other tortoises. Basically, nothing worked. For 40 years, four decades of every day, Don Fausto here again, his very dedicated keeper, the only person he really sort of trusted. The Lonesome George would always pick up his head when he heard Don Fausto's footsteps. But those females that were put with George did eventually lay some eggs. Everyone got very excited in 2008, but they were all infertile. We, in the meantime, were, thinking about these animals not just as interesting species, but as ecosystem engineers. We thought, well, Pinta still needs some tortoises, and what are we going to do in the meantime? Waiting, searching the world's zoological collections for possible Pinta survivors. What can we do in the interim? And we came upon this solution to, the park had 39 hybrid tortoises that had been returned to the archipelago, basically mascots from military academies, colleges on the continent, private collections. And these animals, they didn't want to release to the wild. They don't want them breeding. They're not, and we thought, well, maybe we could solve two problems at once. And we actually had these sterilized, so they couldn't reproduce, or at least the males. And we thought they could be a potential interim solution for having these tortoises on Pinta Island, and we took them there. These are the tortoises in the hold, all with fancy tracking tags, so we can know where they went. And this is unloading them at Pinta Island, still a tortoise-free island. And it's just sort of ironic that hundreds of thousands that were taken in the other direction with the same methods, but now this is Don Fausto cinching up one of these animals at age 70 and carrying them back up into the middle of the island. And just a quick video here, another video snippet of this. Park guards actually said this was some of the hardest work they'd ever done. The tortoises are very, very heavy, but they also swing. As you can see here, Javier very quickly reaches to get this swinging tortoise under control. They had to hike these up about 4 kilometers up into the middle of the island. So there's 39 tortoises. They're still there, and they are doing extremely well. This is trekking them from the coast up basically to the base of that higher promontory. I just put this in. It's also a bit of a testing ground for some of the new park guards. This is not entirely fair. It's a laugh at someone's expense, but they were... this was... the park guards are very supportive of one another. They're also sort of competitive, and this they all got a kick out of this. But at any rate, these animals were released, all 39 of them. They're still out there. We need to go find them again. But the few times we've checked, they're doing what we'd hoped. They do. So Pinta is slowly being engulfed by this woody vegetation. Tortoises push that back. They create light, opportunities for light for the whole herbaceous layer, and they're doing that where they've been released. They're also creating some pretty significant trails among cactus groves, so that when we do have reproductive tortoises to release, there's an infrastructure, if you will, already built for them in terms of moving around and finding resources. The most amazing thing of this is, again, we were criticized a little bit for this, but that it's sort of cruel and unusual to take these animals that had been in captivity, some of them for 50, 60, 70 years, and release them to the wild. Well, the average weight gain in 1 year was 22 pounds. That's the average. So there were some that did twice that and some a little bit less, but they're doing just fine in terms of forage. So Lonesome George died in 2012, and it was a very sad event. I was astounded by, he really is a global phenomenon. There were no less than 2,100 news items the day after he died. He died when we were there. He died quietly on a Saturday night. He was discovered first by Don Fausto, his keeper, on Sunday morning. There was a lot of discussions about what to do next. And there were the discussions to, treat him with dignity and take him back to Pinta Island and bury him. Some people saw him just as another tortoise, and there's a big bone pile, toss him on there and let's get on with things. But a lot of us thought, maybe he could continue to serve as a poster child for conservation and keep this message going. Quickly called my colleague Eleanor Sterling was there at the time and asked her, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City maybe be interested in doing this, and she called around and yes. And so began a very long process of getting Lonesome George to New York. This is the big box he came with. I was accompanied him here to the American Museum of Natural History, where he's been prepared by George Dante on the left here, very skilled specimen preparator, and he's done a wonderful job with Lonesome George. Was on display at the American Museum of Natural History for a couple of months, and where he remains now in a warehouse in New Jersey as the final exhibit space in Galapagos is finished. It's a fairly big undertaking to create the climate-controlled special case. But they're building a whole exhibit about conservation of tortoises around Lonesome George, and perhaps in a year you'll be able to go and see him. So that was to be the end of, really, the sad end of Lonesome George, persisting, if you will, as a specimen in an exhibit, carrying on the message of conservation. But it actually isn't the end of the story, and it has to do with this very strange place called VulcanWolf. It is Wolf. It's named after a famous Ecuadorian geologist named Wolf, Theodore Wolf. And it's one of the last places we ever visited when one of the things we did with this project is to try and visit all of the tortoise populations, do the first really comprehensive survey. And it's quite a place. This is the two northern volcanoes on Isabella Island. This is Vulcan Darwin, and this is VulcanWolf. Go north from here, a couple more Galapagos Islands, and then there's nothing until the Bering Straits. It's a pretty remote place. This is VulcanWolf here. You can see it's like an Adirondack mountain that comes out of the ocean as opposed to out of the Adirondack Plateau. Its vertical elevation is stunning. It's quite a mountain to try and climb and to work on, but it's true Galapagos in terms of just wilderness and very few invasive species here of any kind. Just a spectacular place. Rough country though. Canyons, it's still very active. It's caused some problems working around volcanism, trying to plan these expeditions. Fortunately, this volcano exploded in the other direction, to the east rather than to the west where we were, but it's very active as we speak. It's so remote, it's actually just the site of this recent discovery of the pink iguana. Just a few years ago, a spectacular, large reptile that people were surprised you can still find these things on planet Earth, but you can. Never been described, now officially a new species of land iguana from Galapagos, and they are indeed pink. But on VulcanWolf, we still have no idea how many tortoises there are up there. I think there's 10,000, 12,000, just huge numbers of them. You can see, this is just one example of one gathering of them on one lava flow. But when we were doing this work, this first survey, we were intrigued. There are, again, thousands of endemic native VulcanWolf tortoises. No big surprise there. But we kept finding these pockets of tortoises that, just like that one on Santa Fe, didn't seem to belong there. These ones didn't either, and they tended to be at the base of the volcano in some very narrow canyons. And here they are. Again, if you're saddleback tortoises on a moist volcano, that doesn't make sense. These should be domed or semi-domed tortoises, and some really pronounced saddlebacking here, which is something you just find really on other islands and very arid islands. The genetics group genotyped these animals, and they're really, we first thought, hey, we've got contaminated samples, and then something's gone terribly wrong in the alignments, but it's become quite evident that actually there's a whole soup of tortoises out here. And it's a very remote volcano. There's tortoises from Española, there's tortoises from southern Isabella, there's tortoises from Santiago, but there's tortoises or signatures of them from Pinta and Floriana Islands. So Pinta is Lonesome George's island, and Floriana is an island that lost its tortoises so long ago, Charles Darwin was about the last one to even comment on them. People have never had any pretensions that we would ever find tortoises again for Floriana. They've just been truly given up as extinct. There's not only some of them, there appear to be a lot of them. It's a bit of a joke here. We call them aliens. because genetically they're anomalous, morphologically they're anomalous. But in coming up with that name, we started, what else is called aliens? There's something similar here. I think we know the inspiration for this particular alien. But there's a lot of them, and they are on these, again, probably 10,000 endemic tortoises all over here, but these are where these tortoises of interest are with this distinct morphologies. So it gets back to human-mediated translocations, which I guess I should come up with a simpler term, like people move tortoises around. And this sounds very strange to link pirates and whalers and warships in the War of 1812 to contemporary conservation, but that is indeed the case. As far as we know, and there's a pretty good reason to believe this, at the base of VulcanWolf, this is Vulcan, Ecuador, the last volcano, but there's this huge bay here. It's called Banks Bay. It's very famous. If you're into whaling history, you know about Banks Bay. It was the last place where people would, in the Galapagos, all these sailing ships, there were as many as 700 to 800 whaling ships in the mid-1800s working the Pacific for sperm whales. Almost all of them come into Galapagos to turpin or to catch tortoises. And they would gather, and they would sometimes spend weeks here, just taking a break on a multi-year voyage. And they traded tortoises. There was a record of a British man-of-war and an American frigate meeting in the War of 1812, and the first thing they did was clear all of their decks of the giant tortoises that they had collected and just throw the tortoises in the bay. And they reported those tortoises floating 3, 4, 5, 10 days later. I suspect someone had a tortoise business and went bankrupt, but whatever the case, there was a lot of presence here, a lot of people bringing a lot of tortoises from all over the archipelago, and we think that's what's behind all this, but all of this in Banks Bay, and there's just a few connections of habitat from the bay, the shore, up to the vegetation. Otherwise, it's impenetrable lava flows. So, with possibilities then of Floriana tortoises and Pinta tortoises, to actually recover these species from this strange tortoise soup on VulcanWolf, Park got very interested in this. They basically said, let's go get them. And so this November of last year, or may do this again this year, they provided a ship and a helicopter for 10 days and said, go to it. Go find these tortoises again. And so we did that. Helicopter support was great for getting people up onto the flanks of the volcano where they could get to work fairly quickly. Basically designed all this and deployed them in these big sectors to cover as much as we could of tortoise range. There's another 2 sides of the volcano we can't get to, but this is Banks Bay, and we had the boat anchored here, and each group had a radio to communicate back and forth, and to go and find tortoises that we had identified previously with genetic markers that were from these Floriana or Pinta Islands, but also to recover any tortoise that had a distinct shell that didn't seem to belong there. And this is just an example of a tortoise that is not domed, is probably not endemic, and the kind of things that that our groups of 3 were looking for over a course of 10 days, climbing up and down this volcano. The idea is to find these tortoises of interest, haul them to a point where a helicopter might be able to access them, and then to call in the helicopter on the radios that may or may not have been working in the rain and with weak batteries, and it was quite an operation, but it ultimately was successful. I just want to give you a sense of what this is like. This is on the field end. These are a couple of small saddlebacked females. Females are a lot smaller. They spend so much time, they invest so many of the resources in eggs. They produce 10 to 12 billiard ball-sized eggs, and migrating that they just have much smaller. They put all their resources into reproduction versus growth. But this is the helicopter dropping the jingeo, the attachment point, and to grab these animals. That swinging metal ball was quite lethal. I probably should have been wearing hard hats, but hooking these animals up, and the pilot was just fantastic. It was he moved this machine around like it was a part of his body. He was hanging out of it constantly, just to communicate and to plan all this. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but again, this is on the field end then, getting these animals up. So we ended up finding 32 tortoises of interest in this 10-day period. But we ran out of time. Toward the last few days, we found a lot more that whole other patches of tortoises that we think, well, we'd like to go back and get. On the ship side, this is what it looks like. And I really wish I'd ducked under something, but this was just too good to miss. But these are two larger males coming in, saddlebacked males. As again, all kinds of things can go wrong. But the helicopter pilot was fabulous. He had never worked, and I think on a small boat bobbing in the ocean in heavy wind with live cargo. But we had no problem. We had some close calls, but everything worked fabulously. But at any rate, we ended up finding 32 of these animals, and here they are in the hold in the front of the ship. And there are more and more tortoises. I can't tell you what a mess this was to clean up after 12 days. Unbelievable. We also had to collect up every single excrement that was produced because, there's risks in conservation. There's these animals, as we talk, they're moving storage bins for seeds from another island. And so for the last 9 months, it's like having a child in diapers picking up every single dropping that these animals produce and monitoring the seed loads until they've gone to zero, which they did fairly recently. So this was last November. They recently went to zero. They're just being fed pure grass and other leaves of herbaceous plants, no materials with seeds in them. But got them into captivity back on the main island in the tortoise rearing center, and it was quite something to see wild tortoises adapt to captivity. They were placed in front of them were placed food more succulent than anything they'd ever encountered, but they didn't recognize it. It took a few days for them to actually recognize what better circumstances they found themselves in. But they immediately started to, set up their social hierarchies. They're quite sophisticated animals, despite it. They're a incredible spatial sense, but a lot of complex social interactions going on. But here they are. They have the females. This is the mugshots of all the females that we brought back, and mugshots of the males. And we just this week got the genetics results in. They're extremely encouraging. We actually had gone out to just collect animals. We knew their identities from the previous sampling, but we thought, let's just also collect animals on the gut sense that if they look really strange, they're also genetically likely valuable, and from Pinta, and indeed they are. I think every single one of them. They are hybrids, though. We think there's still some pure Pinta tortoises, pure Floriana tortoises out there, but they, because we find very small ones that are 50%, and clearly they were, but we're dealing with hybrids, which creates some interesting situations. We now have to develop a breeding plan for them, and some people are very critical of this. Like, how can you put impure animals back out into the original islands? I like to look at it that these animals have probably not the full suite of alleles or genetic variations that were unique to their islands. They have some others as well. But we're going to breed them. We're going to maximize the outputs of the ones with the highest genetic content to these islands. But frankly, we're going to get them back out on these islands and let evolution polish them back up to where they were. The evolutionary process will refit these animals back to their islands because they're starting with the original complement of genetic variation, even though there's another complement from the hybridizations. They've just been around 10,000 wolf tortoises, so there's been some crosses, but we shall see. So that's the next step in all of this to produce offspring to release back to Floriana and Pinta Islands, where all hope had been given up. So there's a lot more to tell you about this adventure and this whole program. In any day now, we're going to have 70 people go out and explore this whole lobe of San Cristobal, really the last unexplored tortoise terrain in the archipelago. Huge amount of effort going into this planning. We also hope to explore Fernandina Island this year and next year, where a tortoise was described utterly different. It's called Fantastica. It's got such a weird form, but it was never been seen again. And this is incredibly active volcanically, and no one's ever really been up there. And so that's another part of this plan into the future. But lots of exciting things going in this larger effort to not just stop the hemorrhaging and stop the extinctions, but actually to slowly rebuild and recover this complex back to the numbers it once had. It's a long-term process. I think it's a lot like forestry and growing trees, actually. Just the generation times are a lot like trees. To get these numbers back from 10% to 90% might be 2,200, but we've got a good start here. A lot of exciting things for islands that were just about gone and now have hope again and building numbers back. And it will be interesting. It's just been wonderful. I guess it's some final thoughts here on just conservation. I know so much of the media makes conservation out to be strong personalities and doing glamorous things and saving the world. To me, it's been completely the opposite. It's just sort of being a part of a team that really finding your place and having something very significant to offer and listening and just trying to push something ahead. I think that's the greatest pleasure I've had, is working with these folks across languages, the Park Service, Spanish, Italian. Joe's from Texas, it might as well be another language, but really it's been a tremendous, just a privilege for me to be part of this larger effort, which really, in the grand scheme of things, is about a bunch of people pulling together as a team and trying to tackle a pretty complicated problem across cultures, across languages, and not just languages, Spanish, English, but science and management, et cetera. It's been my good friend Jeffries. We spend a lot of time in the field together and learn a lot from one another. We're also adding, again, back to the analogy of trees, where I've got another 10, 15 years left, but this is going to go another 200 years, actively recruiting the next folks to sort of bring them in early and to make them part of this, because we're not going to be doing this forever, especially young Ecuadorian students, Carlos Cano, Jennifer Vasconez, and this is Freddie Villalba, the new keeper. Don Fausto is retired in Colorado this summer at a training institution, and Elizabeth Hunter was a master's student here, all keeping this work going. So very, very, having just take the long term, not just on the tortoises, but on the program. So I won't go through this, but we do have, there's a lot of folks behind this, and I'm very, very happy to acknowledge them. Of course, the Park Service of the Galapagos is behind all of this. Has this wonderful tradition of being very interested in what scientists have to offer, listening carefully, and then going into their closed room and deciding based on the evidence that they've heard. But a wonderful tradition of integrating science with management and conservation in Galapagos. Galapagos Conservancy funds most of this. The U.S. National Science Foundation has helped a lot, and our team. And some of the photos, Christian Ziegler and Paul Gibson let us use these for presentations. But I also just want to be very grateful for being here at SUNY ESF amongst, students and faculty, just a whole bunch of really good biology going on here, a lot of very applied biology, and it's just a privilege to be part of this. And last, I'm going to embarrass them, but my family here, Thane and Hamish, have tolerated, I think, about 2 years of absence, or 2.5 in total, to make all this work, and I'm very grateful for them, and especially Hamish has helped with the work, and Thane has enabled it all to happen. I will just stop here, just with the final thought. I have, I think, handled 7,000 or 8,000 giant tortoises, measured them, taken their blood, inserted pit tags, and you never get tired of it. And it's always this glint, this gaze that always just arrests me. When they look back at you, they're very peaceful animals. They almost seem kind of wise, but it's almost beseeching sometimes in a way too. It's almost like, they're saying, you almost, killed us off, but just give us a little bit of a chance to, we can do it, we can build ourselves back up again. Yeah, good question. I don't think it's impossible. Tortoises are remarkable. They do float quite well, and they can't swim or direct themselves anyway, but they can periscope their head up, and they can float for weeks. It's possible that tortoise mate, it's like probably a 1 in a million chance, but it's possible it made it across the straits, and maybe we should take that into consideration, but it's also the chances are quite remote, given that we do know people move them around a huge amount. So it can't be discounted, but it's probably not likely. Oh, yeah. Every trip we bring students. We've brought, I must have brought 5 or 6 ESF students over the years. We graduate students, postdocs, but undergrads. And the challenge for me actually is and it's rightfully the pressure is from the Ecuadorian side to provide opportunities for Ecuadorian students, and we do that every single trip, and it's a incredible opportunity for them. Sometimes it's a lesson in the realities of field work, but we always have, almost always have students on our trips.
So you mentioned that there were giant tortoises on other islands, not in the Galapagos. Now, are their numbers like low as in some islands in the Galapagos? And if they are, do you plan on knowing what you did in the Galapagos, transfer that to the other islands?
Yeah, interestingly, the situation in the Indian Ocean is actually much worse. There are a lot of tortoises on one single island, Aldabra. And that island is as vulnerable to sea level rise due to climate change as anything on the planet. It's basically a big flat plate. But they are thinking now of moving Aldabra Island tortoises to other islands, and the work in Galapagos has been both an inspiration and also just a case study that it can be done and it works. They do okay, and they do important things once they get there. So now in the Indian Islands, in the Indian Ocean, amongst the Seychelles, there's a lot of exciting work that's basically pushing this ahead as well, moving some of those animals out to islands that clearly out there, it's quite clear there were lots of different forms on different islands, because you can not just find fossil remains, you can still find remains, bones, huge piles of them. So absolutely, this is influencing what's happening there, and in a good way.
Lori, and then we'll...
What changes did you observe on Santa Fe after putting tortoises there, say after a year or two, to the flora and fauna on the island?
So we are monitoring that. Santa Fe has only had these 210 5-year-old tortoises for 1 year. Effect is absolutely nothing, except in their few places where they've established their beds. However, as those animals reach 20, 30 years, we're going to continue this 200 animals a year for 10 years. Those animals start to grow, the impacts are going to be significant. And so we have a whole series of exclosures to measure the impacts that these animals will have. But it's a long ways off that they will have any impact, but I'm sure they will when they do, and we'll be able to measure it through these exclosures, and we do high resolution drone imaging, but it's going to change the island, but that is the idea. We hope in a positive way, because there's an endemic iguana out there.
All right, so I've got a couple of other things to briefly do so we can get to the reception, and James will be out there. So we've been trying to recognize the speakers with a nice wood bowl from Thomas Huracan, a local woods craft maker. And since James already has a bowl, I wanted something else. It actually has a bowl in it. So I think I'm going to ask him to use this and walk around, answer questions out there. It's a serving tray that's made out of, and it has a bowl embedded in it. Thomas always does such a great job of packing everything, but it's black cherry and sugar maple. It's a really beautiful, one-of-a-kind piece. And on the bottom it says Dale L. Travis Lecture Series Presenter, and so you can keep your bowl at your office, but maybe you could bring this home. And it's a beautiful piece that Thomas made, solid black cherry, a bowl, so it's a smaller bowl, and handle. So we'll see. We're going to try this out tonight. Maybe he'll answer some questions as he walks around with us.
What's next?
So, I also need to thank Joel. Is Joel Shaw here? Joel Shaw just does such wonderful work with all the outreach materials and beautiful cover. And Catherine Landis, who is here, and Sandra Palomino, my administrative assistant, who really, they do all the work. I'm just the face of all this. So thank you very much for coming. The reception should be ready to go right outside the door. Thank you. Have a good evening.